All right. Good day, everyone, and welcome to the GSA Acquisition Policy Federal Advisory Committee, Policy and Practice Subcommittee meeting. I'm Stephanie Hardison, the Deputy Designated Federal Officer for this session. Today's event is being recorded and will be posted to our website with all relevant meeting material. There will be time for any relevant comments or statements towards the end of the meeting from the public. All right, we will now open the meeting for subcommittee chairs by taking roll. Instead of going through the whole roll, we will just take who's in attendance right now. And so Luke, Richard,
Yep.
Nicole, Amlan. All right, and with that, I'll hand it now over to the chair of the committee. Luke.
Did you get Mark?
And Mark, I'm sorry, Mark.
And Mark.
Thank
Great.
you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, David. Thank you, Corey. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today. Really appreciate you folks making yourselves available as we are in our final run-up to the third deliverable of this subcommittee and the committee as a whole. There's been a fair amount of work over the last month, kind of putting together our thoughts and coming up with some hypotheses about an approach and a way to get to the finish line. And so I think today we had planned to make this a working meeting, and we were going to present where we were currently, our current thought process, and essentially what could be a preliminary draft of our recommendations heading up towards May 22nd. The goal being to get the feedback from the folks on this call that we could then incorporate and then kind of turn around and make a couple of turns of a document that would then ultimately be a presentation on May 22nd. I feel pretty good about where we are so far, but we'll get the feedback from the folks in the room today, and we'll see, what next steps we have to take and how much action is necessary in the next month or so. We did put together a few slides where we'll present and talk through what we've done. I did want to, I guess, open it up at first to see if there's anybody who has any news or thoughts or anything they want to begin with or share before we get started. Mark, go for it.
Luke, I know it was last minute, but I did send an email out with some comments, so hopefully people find those helpful.
Great. So yes, Mark, I didn't get a chance to look at them, but the goal today, I think, is to get some verbal feedback from the group and then take your comments, take some other comments we've gotten, whatever feedback we get today from the group, and then rope it into a new version. So thank you. I appreciate your comments, and we'll definitely rope them into version 2.0. Why don't we get started with the slides?
You see my screen, Luke?
Yes. Thank you, David.
Yes, sir.
The other David Wagger, I think, was attempting to join us today. He, I think, was potentially predicting trouble with his connection. So hopefully he'll join us at some point. But thank you. You can go to the next slide. So as I articulated before, I think we're going to go through our working recommendations, look for your feedback, then look to the public for public engagement, and then finish with closing remarks and next steps. Next slide, David. So one of the recurring themes, the recurring theme, or overarching narrative, I think, that we have heard over and over again, and we talked about this at our last meeting and really multiple meetings leading up until now, is the lack of data. And there is, that in and of itself, I think we had struggled with, and this was really the pitch of our last meeting, we had struggled with how to turn that into a recommendation, because it's just overarching and it is not actionable. And so how could we turn what we thought was a glaring omission in kind of the GSA's sustainable procurement strategy into something that they could use to advance sustainable procurement. And so I think after our last meeting, we reverted a little bit to essentially identifying areas where there are gaps, things that we had heard from some of the guests that have appeared at our meetings, things we have heard from some of the other agencies that have engaged on their sustainable procurement journeys, and tried to turn them into some specific subject matter areas that we could address with various levels of recommendations, some more specific than others. And so what we have kind of narrowed in on are really three specific buckets, three areas where the GSA could improve or increase its data strategy to help advance sustainable procurement. The first is in making informed decisions related to the acquisition of sustainable goods. The second is in making defensible decisions related to the selection of vendors. And the third is to really have that kind of functional data that would allow for more informed strategic, organizational, and executive level decision making, so that the GSA or at the executive level or the policy level could really start to put together more surgical strategies that would achieve sustainable procurement objectives. We're going to go into a deep dive a little bit deeper on these in the next couple of slides. Next slide. So the data to procure sustainable goods, and this is probably the category we have heard the most about. There's a huge number of resources here captured in the matrix on the right of this slide. The GSA, from my opinion, as a state public procurement practitioner, is well advanced when it comes to the ability to search for, locate, and identify sustainable goods by certifications or by characteristics. There's an infinite level of resources, almost too many resources for folks at my organization to be able to implement simply. And so while they are fairly far advanced, there is an area of improvement that we've identified. And so that is really in trying to find interoperability and connectivity, and maybe a better way to weave these tools together to make it a more seamless decision-making process for a procurement practitioner at the GSA, or selfishly at the state level when we use the GSA's resources that are available to us. Next slide. The second bucket we've identified, and this is not nearly as mature as the data resources that the GSA has available, and that's really the data to select a vendor. And there's a number of approaches that we can take, but the issue is really about an inability to identify sustainability KPIs. What is the appropriate measuring stick for a firm? How do we assess a vendor's performance, both prior to competing for a GSA contract and then during the term of the contract as well? We just don't have what the appropriate KPIs are, and without knowing what they are, without agreeing on what's important, we can't really set those targets out there for the vendors to aspire to work towards, or really develop their resumes in anticipation of making it a competitive advantage or working towards those things. And I think we've seen and we've heard there are a number of different approaches to this. And I think the GSA has thought about this, and we have seen steps advancing towards reporting greenhouse gas emissions, but it's really the tip of the iceberg. And I think trying to figure out or advance some sort of recommendation along these lines that would at least move the needle a little bit towards giving the GSA a framework by which they could assess vendors and therefore encourage these more sustainable behaviors during the selection process is an area we thought has come up several times and would be ripe for good recommendations. Next slide. And finally, the data for decision making. This is where the executive level, either the GSA administrator or other policy level executives, really don't have that groundwork, that ground level in the trenches data, either on goods, on services, on cost effectiveness or life cycle costs. We're not measuring all of the KPIs of organizational spend that would allow us to make more informed, sustainable procurement decisions. And there are a number of different efforts and attempts where the GSA and other federal organizations have done this. I think we've identified some, and there are probably more we haven't yet identified. But there is, without that kind of organizational data to help inform, executive level decision making and to help monitor and track progress, and then kind of articulate solutions to increase progress or to keep progress moving or continuous improvement. We're kind of just throwing policies in the air and kind of hoping they stick. And so that data, that integral data, to be able to measure these things, to be able to track progress, to be able to report successes, to be able to tell the public that these are the things that we've achieved, and this is where we were last year, and this is where we are this year, and where we want to be next year, we think is very important and probably the toughest of these three recommendations to tackle. But the frameworks may exist out there in other agencies or in the private sector. Next slide. So I think Amlan has put together this wonderful chart of the interconnectivity of a lot of the existing resources. Amlan, do you want to talk us through this?
Sure. Thank you very much, Luke. Something very important that Luke mentioned is the idea of interoperability, that we have, there are the tech tools, then there is data, and the data tends to weave through the many different tech tools. And of course, depending on where we are in the life cycle of that data, it looks different and it is used differently by different stakeholders. So before I jump into the diagram, another way of structuring this recommendation has been to look at how we are focusing, how we are recommending that the focus be not just on product selection, but also on vendor selection. So there's a component of product selection, component of vendor selection. So the question then becomes, what this diagram tries to do is to kind of weave in how we can map the data, the tech tools, as well as with respect to what part is product selection, what part is vendor selection, and then also who are all the participants in this kind of environment, this ecosystem, so to say. So on the left of this diagram, you have what are essentially, I would think of as the impacts or the interface between the technosphere, which is the man-made environment, everything we engineer, everything we manufacture, everything we mine, and everything we grow. And so that interface between all human activity as compared to the natural world from where everything is derived. So realistically speaking, when we're looking at our impact on the environment, we're looking at environmental impacts, so exchanges of flows between the natural environment and the human or the technosphere environment. And then, of course, we're also looking at impacts on water resources, impacts on air quality. And of course, this also converts into emissions, as well as the different kinds of impacts we have on health-related aspects. So specifically material health. So all of that data gets turned into what we refer to as the life cycle inventories. And so these life cycle inventories are at the very basis of these exchanges between the technosphere and the environment that we start archiving and understanding, because these life cycle inventories are the very fundamental basis of all the assessments that happen. When you think about emission factors, when you think about impact indicators, everything comes out of this observed data. right? And so right now, if you look at the world of who is actually looking at this data, who's archiving this data, who's holding it, when in the public sphere, we have Federal LCA Commons, which is kind of a group of various federal agencies put together, and various other stakeholders are contributing to it, and kind of maintaining life cycle inventories for different kinds of environmental impact data that goes in there. Also, there is the EcoInvent database, which was developed in Europe. However, we do tend to use data sets from there every once in a while. And then SFERA has a US specific data set. Of course, the EcoInvent data set is in Europe. SFERA has an American version of it, but it has a lot of proprietary data. So again, some of this data is proprietary. A lot of it is in the public space, and the proprietary data is also available publicly through licenses. So public and proprietary, that's kind of like the focus of the people who are working in that arena. After that, we get to how do we assess this data? So there's the impact assessment methods and criteria for assessment. So standards, ISO standards for lifecycle assessment, impact assessment methods such as Tracy, which is developed and maintained by EPA. We're right now on Tracy 2.2. Energy Star is another EPA system, which again can be used to understand impacts of various products and processes. So this is one level up from where we are just collecting our environmental impact data. Once we have all of that, we get to the phase, which is the labels and the certification, which is the next step. And the labels and certification is where we have a sense of what the impacts of a particular product are. And this is where we say, is this product acceptable for procurement or not? So we are looking at, you have the people who are doing it. So this is, again, program operators for lifecycle assessment. You have various rating agencies who are also looking at it, and basically saying, here is a verifiable way to create labels, develop these labels, develop certifications, make sure we go through third-party verification. And a lot of this is happening in the, a lot of the not-for-profit sector, but as well as some profit ventures. But also notice that as we're moving towards the right on this diagram, we're increasingly getting to, away from the proprietary space, away from the public space into the more proprietary space. At this stage, when we're looking at labels and certifications are often used to by GSA currently and potentially moving forward to help with product selection, to say this product is better than that product because we have the underlying assessment done based on certain standards and third-party verification, and now we know how we can compare this product to another product or a comparable product. And then finally, we get to the aggregation tools, right? In the world of aggregation tools, this is where you are trying to select a product based on certain criteria that your system or select a vendor based on certain criteria that your system requires, or what you're trying to purchase. So this is where we have aggregation tools like Building Transparency's EC3. We have Safer Choice, the SF tool. This is a GSA Advantage. These are places where you can go and kind of shop for what you're looking for. Recognize that underlying all of these two systems, whether it's Building Transparency, SF tool, Safer Choice, everything that gets in there is rated and ranked. How you get to make your decisions there happens based on the previous three stages of assessment and certification. And then finally, as we get to the very far end of that diagram, we have what right now we're finding, and what we heard from a lot of vendors is potentially a space for using AI-based innovation and various other kind of innovative software tools which can provide GSA decision makers the ability to really find and make that selection of products and vendors to the requirements for whatever it is that they're looking to procure. And so really setting up a system for procurement specialists that really helps them, because if you think about it, a procurement specialist is trying to make a decision on using data and tools at a very far end of this chain of custody, so to say, of the data, from where the impacts are occurring to understanding how those impacts should be accounted for in decision making. And so there is a place for a lot of data mining. There's a place, and that's kind of happening out there. We heard from a couple of organizations that are startups actually who are in that space. And I think in order to kind of really energize that space, what would be helpful is to develop an API for requirements. So for a procurement specific scenario, what are the requirements that a GSA procurement specialist would be looking for, and based on those requirements, allow a market of those kind of tools and innovation to kind of thrive. So overall, this is again looking at data, tools, and technologies, and then also seeing how it can integrate seamlessly across this entire life cycle from impact to decision making. Luke, thank you.
So Amla, thank you for taking us through that. Where would you see that solution that we spoke to Cievo, right? I think they're somewhere in the for-profit aggregator, right?
Correct.
So
Yeah.
they have and they're not unique, but they did come to speak to us. I think there's a couple of tools that are starting to operate in that space where they aggregate both publicly available APIs and also internal vendor information, right? So if the GSA is starting to collect information about their own vendor pool, they could potentially have a tool that would pull in both external and internal data and help them kind of give them that dashboard effect of measuring whatever KPIs they deemed were appropriate, right?
Absolutely.
I think that's
and probably I would say probably they're in that aggregator, and probably a little bit maybe to the right of that also, because they're also kind of like, they're making available a service in a competitive space. So absolutely.
Yep.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Just muted myself. Okay, next slide.
Luke, I had a question. This is Rich.
Yep, please.
So down in the trenches, the acquisition workforce is using an increasingly sophisticated set of contract writing tools to actually get these APIs and these requirements under contract going forward. The two most common systems are Prism and also an Appian-based contract writing system, which some agencies are increasingly advocating for uniform adoption across the federal civilian agencies in particular. So these are the actual tools that the acquisition workforce brings up to get these requirements under contract. And so my question has to do with how would all these things to the left of this flow chart into the process find their way into, and does this provide an opportunity to provide standardized contract writing tools to the acquisition workforce to actually implement on a tangible basis the goals and objectives of these data concepts here that we're talking about?
Yeah, great question. Thank you very much. And I guess, and that's, it goes to the heart of this recommendation, is that we want more standardization. On the one hand, we want to have a competitive space where people can write more of these tools, but at the same time, these tools can be helpful and can be used consistently across different cases and different scenarios if there is an underlying infrastructure, what we refer to as data infrastructure, underlying infrastructure of standardization, right? And so again, if you look at what we have here, you have categories that, you have data and tools that have, span beyond various categories, whether it's global warming potential, whether it's material health and safety, and chemical health and safety. So basically, the idea is, can we create an infrastructure that the foundations of which are standardized? So when I mention here, when we talk about the API, there's been a fair amount of conversation about the API. The API would, and development of that API would ensure that everything to the left of that dotted line is already in place, so that when you have multiple vendors writing these contracts, especially technologically advanced contract writing tools, they're all playing from the same game book or playbook. It's playing from the same playbook rather than, kind of like selecting different data sets or selecting, and we've seen this in the world of lifecycle assessment, where not having specified background data sets can lead to like not consistent numbers or inability to make decisions. So I think that's kind of very important, is that what you're seeing to the left of that line is the quote unquote the infrastructure that gets standardized, so that you can have multiple vendors kind of like developing those tools, so that at the end of the day, those tools can be used consistently across across various scenarios.
What I'm reacting to is a presentation 2 days ago by the NASA senior procurement executive advocating that the federal civilian agencies adopt uniform contract writing systems that have full data interoperability, so that their focus, of course, was on driving price rationalization, price comparisons, and getting the best deal for government using pricing data and cost data going forward. But it seems to me that if some of these elements here were baked into whatever government's adoption and deployment of these automated contract tools, that's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the acquisition workforce actually gets these things under contract. And so that was my thinking here.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. In fact, and from what I'm actually, this is kind of music to my ears, because almost everything you said with respect to cost, if you take cost out and put an environmental, material and chemical health and safety, that's what we're trying to get across here, is that if you have that standardized, so there is a place for standardization so that there can be more competition. And when there is competition, on the right side of that dotted line, GSA is likely to get the best tools and therefore be able to select also from the best materials and best products. And what this does also is it significantly reduces the possibility of greenwashing, because then you're all, and I use the word greenwashing softly within air quotes, because sometimes what may look like greenwashing is just because people are referencing different systems. And so, but nonetheless, that can also result in decisions that are greenwash because they're not consistently being made. So this also helps reduce that possibility.
Thank you,
Right,
Armand. Thanks, Richard. Next slide. So I think we've already started, and Richard brought up something I don't think we hadn't really talked about, connectivity of contract writing with some of these available tools to advance sustainable procurement. So that's a good note to file for our next draft. But this is what we wanted to talk about with this group. What are the additional, we've kind of laid out what we've identified as the gaps, but what are the recommendations that we can make based on all the folks we've talked to, based on what we know, based on our own expertise, beyond with respect to goods and services, at least beyond the connectivity, interoperability, and simplification of those tools. What can we say and speak to that would help the GSA develop, objective, verifiable criteria where a vendor selection decision can be made, and ultimately, how can we approach that organization-wide framework for data that'll allow the GSA to, track what they need to track in order to make effective policy decisions. And so we wanted to kind of open it up at this point and really hear if anyone has any thoughts, any ideas. I mean, every time we have this conversation, we've come up with something new and need to incorporate. So just like to open the floor and see what folks have, if anybody's got any ideas to contribute. Nicole.
Hey, Luke. This is terrific. I feel like with each iteration, it just becomes clearer and clearer what this problem space is and how important it is to address it. So I just really, really want to appreciate your leadership here, yours and David's as well. Amlan, I'm just super impressed at the way this, like your thought within this space has progressed, and it is becoming far more transparent, at least for me, with respect to the importance of this. What I'm asking myself on the sidelines now is, what about existing tools that are out there and related to what's happening in the private sector that would help with the simplification process related to goods, related to vendors? And, we spoke with a couple of private sector solutions, such as Cievo and EcoVadis and others. Should we be tipping our hat to some of those private sector solutions as pathways that are worthy of additional exploration here?
I'll hold.
Let me clarify. I'm not talking about calling out specific vendors. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that the private sector is lively right now and they're developing solutions.
Yes. So I would say yes. That's an absolute. We have seen enough to know that there is a maturity developing in these tools that, maybe they're not perfect and maybe they're all a little different and they all kind of have, pros and cons, but they are infinitely better than trying to develop, in my opinion, something internally on your own, So yeah, I think whether it's remember there's a space in the recommendation for recommending an RFI or an RFP or something. I'm sold that the private sector has gotten to a point where you could get a decent number of good responses and let the GSA make a decision from there.
So
Mark?
with that in mind, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Nigel?
Go ahead, Nigel. Yeah, go ahead, Nigel.
So with that in mind, there are structures in place that we could use as a model, as a shared service, similar to what the marketplace is being developed for HR shared service, financials, grants, and so forth, that allow commercial best practices to be able to be offered to federal agencies to choose from, but while also not exclusively saying it must be a private sector solution. So we look into that to do exactly, which is make best practices available and compete with if folks want to build something themselves.
Mhm.
I think Mark has his hand up.
Mark?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I have two questions. Well, maybe two things to ponder. One is, have we delved into seeing what the European Union is doing about this situation? And number two, is it a ripe subject matter for artificial intelligence to dive in and see what it can come up with, since we really don't have a standard, we don't know what we're looking for, and we're trying to gather information? Maybe that's a good application.
Right. I just want to respond to that quickly about the European Union. On the one hand, and because I just recently finished a study looking at procurement GPP practice, green procurement practices, and we're totally in line with the vendor selection and the product selection, and they have developed these ways to integrate the two, and it's very interesting how they're doing that. Of course, I'm looking at it in one particular space, but I think there are a lot more standardization lessons to be learned from there, because again, going back to Nicole's question, I would be careful about tipping our hats to any one particular product, but rather emphasizing the need for developing a general API so that the requirements and the standards are established that anybody can respond to. Which brings me back to Mark's question about the AI. There are a lot of companies out there that are very enthusiastically jumping in and branding the work they're doing as AI. But again, we have to be somewhat careful that oftentimes in stuff like this, there is a necessity to depend on, well, like for example, the ISO has requirements for 12-month contiguous data in the last 5 years, not active real data that is generating, because you could end up cherry picking very good days over bad days. So we have to be a little careful how that AI is used. Having said that, there is plenty of opportunity for using AI, but I think it would be more useful, again, to really help or recommend that GSA declare a clear set of recommendations that can be with appropriate standardization that anybody can respond to, and be as innovative and as as cool as they want to, just as long as they're meeting those requirements. Otherwise, this could get very chaotic very quickly.
And I totally agree with that statement, but maybe as a parallel track until we get more advanced in how we go about this, AI could be an approach.
Yes.
That's all I'm suggesting.
It absolutely, it will be. It absolutely will be. It already is in some ways too.
Yep. Agreed. All great comments, and I think all good stuff for us to incorporate into the next draft. Nicole, you got your hand up, please.
Yeah, just one more thought, and it's really different from the existing path of this conversation. The Acquisition Workforce Subcommittee had an opportunity to talk with the PRISM users group within GSA. And that was a very, very interesting focus group conversation. We felt walking away from that, it felt fairly impermeable, not gonna lie. One of the areas that we saw a bright glimmer of hope was they said that essentially the way the soup and nuts for them is that their engagement with PRISM and what gets inserted in PRISM really connects 100% squarely with the FAR. If the rules are in the FAR, then that's what hits PRISM, and templates are developed that then they need to follow as part of the acquisition or as part of the contract writing process. And so on one hand, as we were talking with them, because it was gosh, easily 6 or 8 months ago, I'm thinking, when we spoke with them. And we know things are moving faster within this space. Depending upon what happens with FAR Part 23 and the rule that's moving forward now, it could be that there is a mandate for intersectionality between PRISM and the new rule. The question for me becomes, how do we make this process a little bit more seamless? And I think this conversation actually speaks to that. So you know, the folks who work in PRISM will develop templates, but back to Amlan's key point, there's going to be data connected. Let's imagine this happens. There will necessarily be touch points with those templates where contract professionals are going to have to go and gather additional information. And what we want to do is make this as seamless as possible, right? We don't want them to go into a rabbit hole with this great chase. And so as we think about recommendations moving forward and interoperability and making this drop dead easy, we should also be thinking ahead towards what those revisions may do as they intersect with PRISM and how we might imagine this process being made easier.
I cannot agree more. It's very, very true. You know, in fact, the last thing you want, I mean, you really want the procurement professional right now. Luke, if you want to go back to the diagram for a second, just to reference what Nicole is saying, right now, most procurement professionals are working at the second to the last column, right? That's where, and they're still struggling to make sense of what they're getting here. They're not even going beyond that, right? So there are other people who are preparing that, and we want to standardize that. That's a whole infrastructure, but that's where the second to the last column is where they are. What we're suggesting is we want this to be moved further, because even this, like even at this level, it can be quite confusing. So if you have two products and you look at material health and safety, unless there is a way to really, if you look at the science behind it, it's very difficult to say for this context, this indicator is better than this indicator. So like, how do you go to that next step? And that's, I think, where the API comes in. And that's where we have the opportunity for the tools, so that the procurement professional is almost being given the answers, and potentially this is where the AI comes in, where for a given problem, for a given procurement scenario, the AI helps identify what the best product is for a given set of indicators and a given set of requirements. And that is where we're not there yet. But if we get there, Nicole, I think we should be able to prevent the procurement decision maker should not have to go any farther than that dotted line, if that makes sense.
Yep. Any other thoughts, comments? Things we should capture? Well, I think we have some good ideas that came out of today's discussion. And we've got some working thoughts about standardization and categorization and, really trying to make, set a standard agency-wide, that we're going to work through. We would like to, I guess, work towards we have to work towards a recommendation in the next 30 days. Next slide. So our plan is to put together a white paper, which we're kind of already in the midst of at this point. Incorporate some of the feedback we heard today, dress up some of the specific approaches we've talked about over the many meetings that we've had, and share it with the full subcommittee by next Thursday. We would be looking for everybody to provide any comments on the draft white paper by 5/3. And, this is obviously the white paper is not the deliverable for May 22nd, but if we can get the white paper to kind of our as the place setting for all of our thoughts and our kind of broad-based recommendations, then writing the slides becomes infinitely easier, right? Because we take the white paper and we'll turn it into draft slides by May 10th. And then we would circulate those slides to this group by May 15th. Or we would circulate the slides by May 10th and get comments by May 15th. At that point, there should be no surprises. I don't anticipate any comments on the slides, but we will be ready, able to rock and roll and present those slides on May 22nd. I think there has been such a fair amount of work from this beginning, with this third semester here and the work that Amlan really kicked us off with in January, tackling these, many of these same issues from a different angle, and kind of working backwards from there and kind of seeing the things and looking at our journey along the last couple of I can't believe it's been 2 years almost, but I think we're ready and we're excited to kind of advance this as our third semester of recommendations. And we really want all of you folk to participate and help us get this into final form over the next couple of weeks. But I will say, I think we're in better shape than we were the last time, or I remember meeting like every 48 hours with different task groups leading up to that last meeting. So I think we're in good shape. I don't know if anyone else has any concerns or wants to raise anything about the approach here.
Luke, your approach is fine. I just wanted to talk about your timeline a bit, because I do know
Sure.
that, we did prepare one, and that just the days of submission are just a couple of days different. It still hits on the 22nd, but I just
Yep.
want to let you know, let you know that, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
So
sure.
as-
Yeah.
as-
So what do we have to push around on this slide here?
No, so the draft slides from the one that was that we submitted was 5/8 in lieu of 5/10.
Okay.
And subcommittee comments on the slides, I think it was going to be, final slides were going to be by May 17th.
Okay.
So still, again, you're still within the,
Yeah.
but I just wanted to
Okay.
bring that to your attention in case it
Okay,
was
good.
mentioned. That's all.
Yep. No, that's good. Those are both achievable. We were we were not delivering on bullet point 3 and early for 4. So I think we can level those out. Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you all for the input on this. This was really the heart of the agenda today. And so we don't have a speaker, and we were really looking to kind of work through this with the folks that were here. So I think we're going to wind up concluding early, but I do want to ask Stephanie if she wants to open it up to public comment, if there's any members of the public here today.
Yeah, thank you, Luke. Yes, so at this time, as we always do, we always like to open the floor up for public comment. And if there's any one who would not like to speak, they could always email us at GapFac, the email address as well, to provide any kind of information or commentary. It doesn't look like we have anyone from the public on at the time, Luke. If you have any other statements or comments you would like to make, I would hand it back over to you at this time.
I do not, other than to say, it has really been a great pleasure working with all of you on this in various capacities. I think over the last 2 years or year and a half, however long it's been, I think we have managed to reach out to everybody on this subcommittee and try to get everybody's input wherever possible or plausible. And so I really, I've really enjoyed working with all of you personally, professionally, and I'm very proud of the work that we have all put together. So I just, this may be, some version of our last Policy and Practice Subcommittee meeting together. And so I just kind of wanted to say thank you all for your wonderful work. It's been a real pleasure. We've still got work to do, and we'll all catch up on May 22nd. Unfortunately, not in person, but we can all virtually cheers at the conclusion of that meeting to what will undoubtedly be a fantastic third deliverable.
And so if I can just add, I would like to echo what Nicole said earlier and what she also just put in the chat. For a moment there, believe it or not, Luke, I thought it was May 22nd, the way you and Amlan was running it down. It was really, really nice. So I think that you guys are gonna do great when presenting on the 22nd, because that was just well put together and well thought of. And also as it relates to Rich's comment as well. So I too have used one of the contracting writing systems, and it would be, and this is not advertisement, but this would be a phenomenal objective for a possible company or something to have, and I'm not an IT professional, so I don't know, some sort of coding or software or something to add that aspect of what Amlan has proposed into the contract writing system. Because what happens is once these agencies get these systems, they have to then include their own regulations. So although there's the FAR, but there's also the DFAR, and then also there's the GSAM, and also, so those specific regulations that are geared towards that particular agency, they have to add those into those systems. They just don't come automatically most times. So if there was a company that actually added this aspect to their software or to their, that would be great. But we can save that for a later time. But
yeah, no, I agree. That was it's a huge new thought that we hadn't brought up before. So we'll have to figure out how to rope that in, definitely.
Well, as the chair, I thought I saw David for a while there.
There he is.
Yeah.
Actually, hello everyone. I'm sorry I was late. I'm at our convention here in Las Vegas. So I appreciate all the work that Luke, you have done. In my absence, I've been at consecutive conventions and meetings over the last 2 weeks. And thanks everyone for all the work you've done on these recommendations. They look great. So thank you, Amlan and Nicole and all, Nigel and all, and Mark.
All right, Luke, if you have no other comments, we can adjourn the meeting at this time. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone on May 22nd from 9 to 12:30.
Great. Sounds good. Thanks,
We'll now
everybody.
end the meeting. Bye-bye.
Right.
Bye, everyone.
All right. Dylan, you can stop recording.